Ethan Sykes pulled his coat tighter against the damp chill as he surveyed the access point to the vertical shaft. The underbelly of the city stretched around him like a forgotten maze, a vast and sprawling warren of corroded metal and twisted pipes. Water dripped from every joint, pooling in oily puddles on the grated floors. Above him, the orbital freight catapult's faint hum resonated through the structure, a constant reminder of the high-stakes system they were here to stabilize. Without the electromagnets working properly, the spine's delicate operations would grind to a halt, threatening everything it supported. The latest coolant fluctuations had triggered alarms back at corporate HQ. For the people running the show, it was numbers on a screen. For Ethan and his crew, it was the difference between a functional system and catastrophic failure. He ran a hand through his graying hair and exhaled a sharp breath, his eyes squinting at the narrow shaft ahead. "All right, lads," Ethan said, his voice carrying the kind of gruff authority earned through years of thankless work. "Let's make this quick. Catapult can't keep cool without this fix, and I'm not keen on fried circuits. Or fried plumbers." The crew chuckled nervously, though the tension was palpable. The diagnostic drone they'd sent ahead hadn't made it far. Its signal had gone dark just beyond the first bend, leaving only garbled static on their monitors. That left the job to human hands. And when the location of the leak was pinpointed, deep in a confined vertical shaft where most wouldn't fit, Ethan had stepped up. Compact, wiry, and seasoned in tight spaces, he knew there was no one else better suited for the task. Or at least that's what he told himself. The crew worked around him, attaching the harness to the industrial winch as the whine of its motor echoed through the cavernous tunnels. Ethan methodically adjusted his gear, testing the weight of the toolkit strapped to his hip. It felt heavier than usual, though he chalked it up to the tension twisting in his gut. He tightened the straps of his harness, ensuring it wouldn't budge under strain, then grabbed his helmet and switched on the mounted light. "Sure about this, Sykes?" one of his crew asked. The younger man's voice wavered slightly, betraying the unease everyone was trying to hide. Ethan nodded, forcing a wry grin. "Better me than you lot. Besides, I don't trust anyone else to get it done right." He stepped toward the edge of the shaft and peered into the abyss. The metal walls were slick with condensation, the result of coolant spraying from some unseen rupture far below. Frost clung to the edges, glistening in the beam of his helmet light. The distant hum of the catapult vibrated through the structure, its rhythmic pulse both reassuring and ominous. "Lower me slow," Ethan ordered, his voice firm. "Don't rush it." The winch groaned to life, and Ethan felt the harness tighten around his chest as he began his descent. The air grew colder the further down he went, the walls narrowing and glistening with moisture. His helmet light cut through the swirling mist, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. Every creak of the winch and hiss of leaking coolant amplified the stillness around him, making the space feel even more claustrophobic. The shaft was a tunnel of grime and decay, its decades of neglect evident in every rusted rivet and discolored surface. His sensor pad flickered as faint anomalies registered in the periphery. Erratic heat signatures that flared for a second before vanishing. "Bloody interference," Ethan muttered under his breath. The anomalies didn't make sense this far down. The coolant should have drowned out any erratic thermal readings, but he had bigger things to worry about. He focused on steadying his breathing, the rhythmic hum of the winch and the occasional hiss of leaking pipes becoming his only companions. Halfway down, he signaled the crew to pause, raising a gloved hand. Something had caught his eye. He adjusted the beam of his helmet light, sweeping it over the walls. Deep, clean grooves lined the metal, their edges unnaturally smooth. Ethan frowned, leaning closer. These weren't cracks from wear and tear, nor were they caused by coolant bursts. "These aren't from coolant bursts," he whispered into the comm. Static crackled in response, but no voice came through. He glanced upward, his light tracing the now distant lip of the shaft. The crew was out of sight, their voices silent. The faint hum of the catapult felt like it was growing louder, resonating deep in his chest. A shiver ran down his spine, but he pushed the unease aside. "Get it together, Sykes," he muttered to himself. Gripping the winch cable tighter, he gestured for the crew to resume lowering him. The winch creaked, and the descent continued. The winch jolted suddenly, throwing Ethan against the cold, slick wall of the shaft. His gloved hands tightened around the cable, the harness digging painfully into his chest. "What's going on up there?" he barked into the comm, his voice echoing up the confined space. Static hissed in response. No reassuring voices, no instructions, just silence. The cable jerked again, harder this time, throwing him downward in a violent lurch. His stomach dropped, the winch groaning like a dying animal. Ethan craned his neck, squinting up the shaft, but his helmet light couldn't penetrate the gloom. Then, without warning, a sharp metallic ping echoed through the tunnel, followed by an unnatural stillness. The cable snapped. For one horrifying moment, Ethan hung suspended, weightless in the dark, his breath caught in his throat. Then gravity claimed him, and the shaft blurred around him as he plummeted. His helmet light flickered madly, the beams illuminating jagged metal edges and spiraling shadows. He flung out his arms, trying to grab onto anything in the dark. His hands clung to pipes and wires, but he couldn't maintain his hold. Ethan's body tensed instinctively, bracing for impact. He slammed into a metal platform with a bone-rattling thud, the impact driving the air from his lungs. Pain erupted in his ribs as he rolled to a stop, his helmet skidding off to one side. For a moment the world was a spinning blur of agony and flashing red indicators from his datapad. He gasped for breath, each inhale sharp and shallow. His ribs protested with every movement as he gingerly propped himself up. He groaned, clutching his side. His datapad flickered, the diagnostic showing a litany of system errors. Communications, offline. Location sensors, offline. Safety link, offline. He was cut off, completely alone. Ethan forced himself to sit up, his hands trembling as he reached for his scattered toolkit. Tools glinted faintly under the stuttering light from his helmet, which lay tilted against a nearby railing. He scooped them up, pausing to steady his breath. Above him the shaft stretched into an infinite black void. No sound came from above. No shouts, no attempts at rescue, just silence. The platform beneath him groaned ominously, swaying slightly with the structure's distant vibrations. It jutted out into an unfamiliar maintenance corridor, its edges jagged and rusted. The air was dense and acrid, a tang of burning metal and something he couldn't quite place, a bitter chemical scent that made his nose sting. With no other choice, Ethan pocketed his tools and limped forward. Each step sent sharp twinges through his ribs, but he pressed on, one hand braced against the wall for support. The hum of electromagnetics vibrated faintly through the metal, a steady undercurrent that seemed to grow louder with every step. The corridor opened abruptly into a cavernous chamber and Ethan froze, his helmet light sweeping over the space. The walls rose impossibly high, lined with colossal electromagnetic coils that pulsed faintly with weak energy. Their usual blue glow was tainted green by the coolant leaking from ruptured pipes, dripping steadily into wide pools below. The liquid shimmered with an otherworldly radiance, casting eerie reflections that danced across the chamber. Shadows flickered erratically, warping with each weak spark that sputtered from the coils. The hum was louder here, resonating deep in Ethan's chest. He hesitated at the threshold. "Focus," he muttered to himself, clutching his toolkit tightly. His boots splashed through a shallow puddle as he stepped into the chamber, the coolant chilling him through the soles of his shoes. He moved cautiously, his eyes darting to every shifting shadow. The walls bore strange marks, deep, precise grooves that ran along the metal with an unnatural symmetry. Lines running parallel like a circuit diagram. Ethan stopped to inspect one, running his fingers over the edges. His heart pounded as his mind raced through possibilities, none of them comforting. A sudden hiss made him spin, his helmet light cutting through the dark. One of the pools bubbled slightly, the liquid rippling outward as if something had disturbed it. Ethan froze, every muscle tensed, his breath shallow. The whistling started faintly then, a soft, musical sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It reverberated through the chamber, weaving itself into the hum of the coils. At first he thought it was the machinery, but as the sound grew louder, it became clear. This was something alive. He tightened his grip on his wrench, his knuckles white. The green glow reflected off the coolant pools, painting the chamber in sickly light as the whistling shifted in tone, carrying a deliberate, almost curious rhythm. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. He wasn't alone down here. His stomach churned as the shadow shifted. It was like nothing he had ever seen before. An insectoid nightmare, its glossy black exoskeletons shimmering with a wet, liquid sheen. The sharp angles of its triangular head gave it an alien cruelty, and its scalpel-like limbs crackled faintly with bursts of bioelectric energy sparking in the dim light. The creature moved unnervingly slowly, deliberate in each motion, as if it was entirely unconcerned with him, at first. Its head tilted slightly, the reflective black surface showing rows of eyes, the glint of the light refracting like glass. Ethan's fingers tightened on the wrench in his hand, his chest constricting as his breath quickened. He crouched low, willing himself to stay as still as possible. Then another emerged. He'd heard rumors of things in the dark, but he just chalked it up to urban myths started by the people living on the city's edge. Whistlers is what they'd called them. The faint whistling, melodic and surreal, grew louder. More whistlers crept from the edges of the chamber, their limbs clicking softly against the metal grating. Their movements were unnervingly coordinated, as if choreographed. Ethan's heart pounded like a drum in his chest as he counted them. 3, 4, 5. Each moved with a surgeon's grace. Sparks flew as they worked, illuminating the cavern with erratic flashes of white and green. But then one stopped. It stilled, mid-motion, its triangular head snapping sharply in Ethan's direction. The whistling shifted in tone, losing its hypnotic melody and taking on a sharper, more discordant pitch. The other creatures froze too, their heads turning one by one, until every faceless gaze was locked on him. "Oh, no," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. The lead whistler lunged. Ethan reacted instinctively, throwing himself backward as the creature's limbs slashed through the air where he had been standing a moment before. The sound was sharp and clean, like a blade cutting through fabric. He hit the ground hard, his wrench skittering away across the slick surface, his ribs erupting with pain. Panic surged through him as the creature's whistling became a high-pitched wail. He scrambled to his feet and bolted, his boots slipping against the coolant-slicked floor as he ran toward the nearest corridor. The sound of clicking limbs followed close behind. The whistlers were coming after him. Each step they took seemed deliberate, as though they weren't chasing him but hurting him. Ethan ducked under a low-hanging pipe, the sharp edge of its corroded metal scraping his shoulder. He vaulted over a collapsed section of the floor. Behind him the whistlers were relentless, their glossy carapaces glinting in the faint light of his helmet beam as they pursued him through the maze-like chamber. A burst of sparks lit up the tunnel as one of the creatures slashed through a coolant pipe. A spray of freezing mist filled the air, obscuring Ethan's vision for a moment. He coughed and stumbled, the icy vapor biting at his exposed skin. But he pushed forward, his instincts screaming at him to keep running. The tunnel narrowed, forcing Ethan to squeeze through a tight vent. He twisted his body sideways, the rough edges of the metal scraping against his suit as he clawed his way through. His helmet light flickered, catching a fleeting glimpse of a whistler's limb. Ethan dropped out of the vent into another corridor, his knees buckling as he hit the floor, and there was a piercing pain in his injured side. The momentary silence felt deafening, but he knew it wouldn't last. He glanced back at the vent just in time to see the first whistler emerge. "Move, move, move," he shouted to himself, forcing his aching body into motion. He sprinted down the corridor, his legs already aching. The sound of the whistlers grew louder, their relentless pursuit driving him forward. He knew he couldn't outrun them forever. His mind raced, searching for a plan, for anything that could buy him more time. The only thing louder than the whistlers was the pounding of his own heart. Cornered near some massive coils, Ethan's breath came in sharp gasps, his mind racing as the whistlers advanced. Their hard-shelled limbs clicked against the metal floor, echoing like the ticking of some inescapable clock. Their heads tilted in unison, observing him with an intelligence that made his blood run cold. The melodic whistling had shifted into something more aggressive, each note reverberating like a death knell. Every option felt impossible, every escape route blocked. Then his eyes landed on a bank of emergency release levers. An idea struck, dangerous and desperate, but it was all he had. He threw them all open. This whole section would be underwater in moments. Ethan bolted, his boots splashing through ankle-deep water that was rising far too fast. The whistling behind him grew faint, but he didn't trust it. The freezing cold climbed to his knees, its icy touch numbing his legs as he waded through the maze of tunnels. That water was so cold. A deafening crash echoed behind him as part of the ceiling gave way, sending a deluge of water surging forward. Ethan gritted his teeth and pushed harder, forcing his body to move faster. The tunnels had become a labyrinthine nightmare, every corridor a potential dead end, every turn a gamble. The water reached his waist. It surged around him, carrying debris, chunks of metal, shattered tools, and glowing remnants of coolant. Ethan clawed his way upward, hauling himself onto a ledge as the current threatened to drag him under. The whistlers were no longer visible, but he could hear their faint, persistent whistling somewhere in the distance. He couldn't tell if it was coming closer or if his own mind was playing tricks on him. Ahead, a ventilation shaft offered a slim chance at escape. Ethan scrambled toward it, his hands slipping on the wet metal as he tried to climb. The water reached up to the ledge now, cold and relentless. His muscles ached with every movement, but adrenaline kept him going. The shaft was narrow, barely wide enough for his shoulders, but it was his only option. He pulled himself into it, gasping as the water surged beneath him. The sound of rushing liquid filled the space, deafening and oppressive. He crawled upward, his fingers scraping against the rusted walls, his breath coming in desperate gasps. Behind him, the faint whistling grew louder. The creatures were following. The shaft shuddered as something struck its base, and Ethan's heart sank. He climbed faster, his hands slick with coolant and sweat, his legs trembling with exhaustion. The air in the shaft grew thinner, every breath a struggle, but he didn't stop. A sudden burst of water shot up the shaft, nearly knocking him loose. He braced himself against the walls, coughing as the spray hit his face. The whistling was closer now, more urgent, as if the creatures knew they were losing him. Ethan forced himself to climb higher, ignoring the burning in his arms and the searing cold of the metal and freezing water against his skin. Finally, he reached the top of the shaft. A grated hatch barred his exit, its rusted bolts barely holding it in place. He slammed his shoulder against it once, twice, until it gave way. Ethan tumbled onto a dry platform, the air cold but blessedly free of the oppressive wetness below. He lay there for a moment, gasping, the faint whistling fading into the distance. For now, though, he was alive, and that was enough. Exhausted and drenched, Ethan emerged into the main shaft, only to find the winch disassembled. Tools and cables lay strewn across the floor, but no sign of his team. At first he thought they were cowards who'd abandoned him, but on second thought he was sure he would have done the same thing. He began the arduous climb back to the surface, each rung of the ladder a battle against gravity and fatigue. When he finally stumbled into the control room, no one was there. Was he the only one to make it back? He collapsed into a chair, knowing he was all alone. He sat for a long time, the cold and pain replaced by grief.